Can you imagine sitting down for a peaceful family dinner, only to have your entire family ambush you with a plan to take over your most prized possession? That's exactly what happened to me. Please stay with me as I tell you my story, and please don't forget to support our channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing with your loved ones. It was a typical Sunday at my parents' house. The table was set, the smell of roast chicken filled the air, and the familiar sense of expectation pressed down on me the moment I walked through the door. Being the oldest daughter, I had always carried the burden of responsibility, but tonight, something felt heavier than usual. My sister Brittany arrived late, as always, with her husband Todd and their 3 kids. The children burst into the room full of energy, running around and knocking into chairs while my parents smiled proudly, as if the chaos was charming instead of exhausting. Dinner began as it usually did, small talk and surface-level conversation, until Brittany cleared her throat. With a smug grin, she dropped the bomb. "We're moving into your lake house next week," she said as if it were already decided. Her kids immediately chimed in, bickering over which bedrooms they had already claimed. My fork froze midair. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her, but then I caught the satisfied look on my mother's face and the approving nod from my father. I asked calmly what she meant, but my parents jumped in before she could answer. "Brittany and the kids need more space," my dad said, his tone carrying the weight of finality. My mom leaned forward, her voice soft but sharp. "It's family duty, Chloe. You don't need such a big place all to yourself." My heart sank. They weren't asking me. They were telling me. The lake house wasn't just a piece of property. After my divorce, it became my sanctuary, the one place that was truly mine. I had poured my savings and sweat into restoring it, repairing flood damage when no one offered to lift a finger, working late into the night to make it feel like a home again. Every wall carried a piece of my effort, every corner a reminder of my strength. And now, they were treating it like a spare room they could hand over without my consent. As the conversation spiraled, Brittany leaned back with a triumphant smile, clearly expecting me to nod along as I always had in the past. My parents used the same old tactics: guilt, manipulation, and thinly veiled disappointment. "Where will they go if you don't help?" my mom asked. "Do you really want to break your father's heart?" My father shook his head as though I was being unreasonable. In that moment, something inside me shifted. For years, I had let them make decisions for me, had given in to keep the peace, had watched Brittany get everything she wanted at my expense. But looking at them around that table, I realized this wasn't about helping family. This was about control, about taking from me because they thought I wouldn't fight back. I felt a clarity I hadn't known before. My voice didn't shake when I said no. Their smiles faltered and the room grew cold. For the first time, I didn't fold. I protected what was mine, and I walked away from that dinner knowing nothing between us would ever be the same again. I sat there at the table, staring at the faces of the people who were supposed to love me, and all I could feel was the weight of every unfair moment that had led to this night. Memories came back like sharp flashes. When I was in high school, my parents had promised me they were saving for my college. I worked hard, kept my grades up, and trusted them. But when it came time to enroll, I was told the money was gone. Later, I found out it had been spent on Brittany's wedding dress, her reception, and a honeymoon in Italy. I swallowed my disappointment back then, told myself family comes first, but the truth was I had been robbed of something that should have been mine. It didn't stop there. Every time Brittany wanted something, my parents bent over backwards to give it to her. When she and Todd borrowed thousands of dollars, it was written off as helping them get on their feet. Nobody cared that I was working 2 jobs, paying off student loans, and fixing up the lake house on my own. I never saw a dime back, and I stopped expecting it. At that table, listening to them gang up on me, I realized this wasn't about one request. It was about years of being taken for granted. As they spoke, I thought about the night the lake house flooded. The water ruined the floors, warped the doors, and left mold climbing up the walls. I had stood there knee-deep in dirty water with a bucket, exhausted and scared, while my family sent me photos of themselves on a beach in the Caribbean. Not one of them came to help. I had rebuilt that place from nothing with my own hands, and now they sat across from me acting like it belonged to them. "Where will Brittany's kids go if you don't step up?" my mother asked, as if the roof over their heads was my responsibility. "Do you really want to break your father's heart?" she added, pressing on the guilt she had always used to control me. My father gave me that disappointed look he had perfected, the one that made me feel like a selfish child even when I was doing nothing wrong. Brittany just smirked, knowing she had them in her corner, waiting for me to fold like I always did. But something in me hardened that night. For the first time, I truly saw it for what it was. A plan they had cooked up behind my back, counting on me to stay silent. I wasn't being asked. I was being cornered. I looked at each of them, their voices blending together, and instead of guilt, I felt something else, clarity. I understood that I had been trained my whole life to give in, to sacrifice my happiness for Brittany's comfort, and this was just the latest chapter in the same story. Only this time, I wasn't going to play my part. The room was buzzing with tension, voices overlapping as everyone tried to convince me to surrender. I sat there listening, letting them believe I was still deciding, though my choice had already been made long before. Without a word, I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. The sound it made when I placed it firmly on the table cut through all their noise. My father's words stalled in his throat, my mother leaned forward, and Brittany's smirk wavered. I opened the folder slowly, giving them time to feel the weight of what was coming. Inside were contracts signed by contractors, engineers, and city officials. There were permits stamped and dated, laying out everything in black and white. I slid the papers across the table so they could see for themselves. The lake house is scheduled for a complete renovation, I said evenly. Work begins this week. It's going down to the studs. There will be no moving in. For the first time that evening, silence filled the room. My father cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure, but his practiced tone of authority carried no power over me anymore. He muttered something about family obligations, about finding another way, but the words rang hollow. My mother's eyes watered, her tears dropping on cue as she whispered about the grandchildren having nowhere to go. Brittany's confident smile vanished altogether, her face stiff with shock. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg for them to understand. Instead, I spoke with the calm finality of someone who had already won. This isn't up for debate, I told them. The house is under construction, and even if it wasn't, it's mine. You don't get to decide what I do with it. My sister's eyes darted to the papers, as if searching for a loophole, but there was none. Every signature and permit proved I was in control. They tried to throw threats at me. My father brought up inheritance, insisting I'd regret pushing them away when the time came. I reminded him I knew exactly what he had done with his will years ago, and that his threats were meaningless. My mother tried her old trick, clutching her chest as though the stress would break her, but I didn't bend this time. Your poor planning, I said slowly, does not become my responsibility. You knew what you were doing when you promised my house to Brittany without asking me. The room grew heavy with the weight of my words. Nobody had ever seen me speak like that before. For years, I had been the daughter who stayed quiet, who sacrificed, who accepted whatever scraps were left after Brittany got her way. That version of me was gone. I stood, slid the folder back into my bag, and pushed my chair in neatly. My family's eyes followed me as I walked toward the door. No one tried to stop me, no one called my name. All they could do was sit in the wreckage of their own plan, stunned by the fact that I had finally said no. When the door closed behind me, it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet click, but to me it sounded like a wall being built, solid and unshakable. For the first time, I left that house with my head high, carrying not just my folder, but also the certainty that I had drawn a line they would never cross again. The moment I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me, but it did nothing to calm the rush of adrenaline running through me. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary as I drove away, every breath coming out uneven. For years, I had walked out of that house feeling defeated. Tonight, I was trembling, but it wasn't fear. It was the release of years of silence. I pulled over once I was a safe distance away and called Miguel, the contractor who had been helping with the upcoming project. His voice was steady, practical, the exact thing I needed in that moment. I asked him to double-check the smart locks and cameras we had already installed at the lake house. He assured me they were operational and even linked to my phone so I could see any activity in real time. That gave me a wave of relief I hadn't expected. Then I told him to go a step further. Place dumpsters along the garage entrance, I said. I don't want anyone trying to slip in. Miguel didn't ask why, he already knew. He had seen me during the worst days after the flood, slogging through mud and mold, doing work most people would have walked away from. He knew my family had left me to face it all alone back then. When he answered, there was a hint of loyalty in his tone. I figured they might try something after tonight, he said. Don't worry, I'll take care of it. For the first time in hours, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. I wasn't standing by myself anymore. My family might not respect me, but I had built connections with people who did. These were people who had seen my effort and treated me as someone worth listening to. That meant more than any empty promises from my parents or Brittany ever had. As I continued driving, my phone lit up again and again. Calls, texts, voicemails, each one angrier than the last. I glanced at the screen but refused to answer. The old me would have picked up, desperate to explain, to calm things down, to patch over the cracks that weren't mine to fix. But this time I hit ignore every single time. Let them stew in their disappointment. My silence was my answer. The car's headlights cut through the dark as I turned toward the lake road, and for a moment, I thought about what the house meant to me. It wasn't just walls and windows. It was proof that I had survived heartbreak and betrayal before and built something strong from the ruins. Protecting it wasn't selfish, it was necessary. When I finally reached the driveway, I sat for a moment, staring at the structure I had poured myself into. Miguel's crew had already started securing the property, moving equipment into place, and making sure no one could slip in uninvited. The sound of work in the quiet night felt like reassurance, like someone else was guarding the boundary I had just drawn. My phone buzzed again, and this time I turned it face down. I had spent too many years answering every demand, every guilt trip, every accusation. Tonight, I chose peace. Tonight, I chose me. The following Monday, I drove up to the lake house with a strange sense of calm. I had prepared for a storm, but I wasn't expecting the sight that greeted me. At the end of my driveway sat a large moving truck, its engine idling, and Brittany pacing back and forth in front of it like she owned the place. Her arms flew around as she shouted at my contractor Ray, who stood with his crew forming a solid line across the driveway. The men were steady, their presence alone enough to block any attempt to push through. I parked a short distance away and walked toward the commotion. Brittany's face lit with fury the moment she saw me. She stormed up, waving an old house key in her hand like it was a weapon. "This is still mine," she hissed, jamming it into the lock on the side door. The key didn't even turn. Instead, the new security system spoke clearly in an automated voice. "Unauthorized entry attempt detected." The words echoed across the yard, robotic and final, making Brittany's face burn red. Her anger only grew. She shouted at me about family, about obligations, about how I had betrayed her children by taking away their new home. I let her words wash over me, my arms crossed, my eyes steady on hers. I could see she was expecting me to break down, to argue, to defend myself. But silence was more powerful than anything I could have said. When her shouting failed to move me, she spun around to the movers and barked orders. "Unload everything. Put it all on the lawn. She can't stop us." The crew hesitated, glancing at me and then at Ray, who stood there unmoving, a quiet wall of resistance. But Brittany insisted, so they began to unload heavy furniture, setting couches, dressers, and boxes across the grass like they were marking territory. She folded her arms, daring me to fight back, certain she had cornered me again. Instead of reacting, I pulled out my phone and made one simple call. Within minutes, I was connected to a local auction house I had worked with before. Calmly, I explained the situation and arranged for a pickup that very afternoon. Not only would the items be removed, but all proceeds would go to a foster youth program that furnished homes for kids aging out of the system. My voice never wavered as I gave the details. "The items are considered abandoned on my property," I told them. "Please send a truck." When I hung up, I looked at Brittany and gave her the smallest of smiles. The color drained from her face as the movers realized what had just happened. They looked to her for direction, but she had nothing left to say. For the first time, she saw that I wasn't bluffing, that I had already thought 3 steps ahead. Ray placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder as his crew stood watch. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't lose my composure, and I didn't let her chaos pull me in. Watching Brittany's furniture sit on the lawn, waiting to be hauled away for charity, I felt a quiet victory. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about proving that her manipulation no longer worked on me. And the stunned expression on her face told me she finally understood. When I pulled up to the property later that week, the sound of hammers and saws filled the air. Walls were already stripped bare, the lake house halfway down to its bones. I felt a strange mix of sadness and pride watching it all come apart, knowing it was only so it could be rebuilt stronger. But I barely had a moment to take it in before my parents' car rolled up. Frank and Linda stepped out, both wearing the same shocked expression as they stared at the house. My father's jaw tightened as he took in the mess of scaffolding and dumpsters. "What have you done, Chloe?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority he had relied on my whole life. "You've ruined everything. That house could have been a legacy for your sister's family." His words were heavy, but I didn't flinch. I let him rant until he finally pulled out what he thought was his strongest card. "If you go through with this, don't expect a penny from us when we're gone. You'll be cut out completely." For a long time, those words might have scared me. But not anymore. I looked at him calmly and said, "You already changed the will, Dad. I know about the meeting with the lawyer after I refused to sign Todd's loan papers. So don't act like you're taking something from me when you already handed it over." His face froze, the bluff exposed, the power gone from his threat. He turned away, his silence saying more than his anger ever could. My mother stepped forward then, her eyes watery, her voice trembling as she played the part one knew so well. "Chloe, please think about your niece and nephews. They'll never understand why their aunt wouldn't help them. You're breaking this family apart." She clutched her hands together as though praying for my mercy. For years, her tears had been my weakness, the rope that pulled me back in. But this time I didn't bend. Instead, I pulled a rolled blueprint from my bag and spread it across the hood of my car. "Do you see this?" I asked, pointing to a section labeled Children's Reading Nook. "This is going to be a space for kids in the foster program, the same one receiving Brittany's abandoned furniture. While you accuse me of being selfish, I'm opening my doors to children who have no one. I'm not taking from anyone, I'm giving back." The silence that followed was louder than their earlier shouting. My mother's tears slowed, her mouth opening and closing without words. My father looked down at the papers, his face stiff, but he didn't argue. They were confronted not just with my choices, but with their own neglect, with the truth that I was doing more for strangers than they had ever done for me. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Their stunned expressions were enough. They came expecting to manipulate me with fear and guilt, but instead they were forced to see me as someone they couldn't control. Someone who stood on her own, stronger than they ever expected. When they finally left, I stayed behind, watching the workers continue their task. The noise of construction no longer sounded harsh. It sounded like progress, like freedom. And for the first time in years, I felt the balance shift entirely in my favor. Weeks passed before I heard from my parents again. Then came the dinner invitation. Something in the way it was worded made me suspicious, but I decided to go. When I arrived, the table was already set, and sitting with them was Pastor Williams, the man they had always leaned on to give weight to their arguments. My heart sank. This wasn't dinner. It was an ambush. The moment I sat down, my father cleared his throat and began. "Chloe, we asked Pastor Williams here because we want peace in the family. People in the community are already whispering. They say you're turning your back on us, on your own sister." His words were calm, but I could hear the pressure behind them. My mother picked it up quickly. "Everyone is talking about how cold you've become. You're making us look divided, and that isn't how family should be." She folded her napkin in her lap, her voice soft but cutting. Pastor Williams nodded gravely. "Chloe, I've known your family a long time. Unity matters. Harmony matters. Surely there must be a way to settle this without so much bitterness." He looked at me with patient eyes, expecting me to bend the way I always had. But I didn't argue. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out my tablet. I set it on the table and swiped to the first set of photos. Bright images of the renovation lit up the screen, new beams, restored windows, fresh walls rising where rot had once been. The house looked alive again. For a moment, even Pastor Williams leaned forward, impressed. Then I swiped again and the mood shifted. Pictures of warped floors and cracked ceilings appeared, taken after the flood years ago. The water lines stained the walls, mold creeping along the corners. I could almost smell the dampness just from looking at them. My parents glanced away, their faces tightening. I tapped the screen again, and this time I showed the text messages. Long strings of words I had sent, begging for help when the damage first appeared. Messages that had gone unanswered. Pleas that were ignored while the house decayed. My voice stayed even as I said, "This is what I lived with. This is what I asked you to see. And this is what you chose not to deal with." Pastor Williams shifted uncomfortably. His eyes moved from the photos to my parents, and the silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't awkward, it was condemning. The weight of what I had shown was undeniable. For once, my mother didn't try to spin it. Her hands trembled slightly as she whispered, "I should have helped with those repairs." The words were soft, but they were real. The first real apology I had heard from her in years. My father stayed stiff, his mouth a thin line, but even he didn't speak. I powered off the tablet and slid it back into my bag. You wanted me to hear about family harmony, I said quietly. But harmony isn't built by pretending. It's built by facing the truth. Pastor Williams gave a slow nod, his eyes no longer urging me to compromise, but instead studying my parents. The balance of the evening had shifted. For once, they weren't in control of the story. I stood to leave, my heart steady. They had tried to corner me, but I walked out of that room knowing they had seen everything I carried. The work, the pain, and the proof. And this time, there was nothing left for them to twist. The call came on a quiet Thursday evening. I was sitting on the porch of the lake house, watching the last bit of daylight fade over the water, when my phone buzzed. The name on the screen made me pause. Todd. Of all people, he was the last one I expected to hear from. For a moment, I considered letting it ring out. But curiosity won. I answered. His voice was low, almost hesitant. Chloe, I need to say something I should have said a long time ago. There was no arrogance, no sharp tone. Just a tired honesty I hadn't heard from him before. He went on, stumbling over his words at first. I know I played a part in all of this. I let Brittany push me into things I wasn't proud of. I stood by while she made demands of you, and I didn't stop her. I thought going along with her was easier than standing up. That was cowardly, and I regret it. I stayed quiet, letting him speak. He sighed into the phone, the sound heavy. The truth is, I knew what we were asking of you wasn't fair. But I didn't have the backbone to say it out loud. I watched you fight us off and still carry yourself with dignity, and it made me realize how weak I've been. I'm sorry for the part one played in trying to corner you. Hearing those words surprised me more than I could admit. For so long, it felt like everyone was aligned against me, like I was fighting an entire wall of resistance. And now here was Todd, breaking the silence, admitting what none of them had dared to say. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was recognition. That alone felt like a kind of victory. I can't undo what's been done, he continued, his tone softer now. But I wanted you to know I see it clearly. I see you were right to stand your ground. You didn't deserve the way we treated you. My grip on the phone tightened. Part of me wanted to remind him of every slight, every selfish move he and Brittany had made. But another part recognized this for what it was, a crack in the facade, a moment where truth slipped through. Thank you for saying that, I replied simply. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. And for me, that was enough. When the call ended, I sat in silence, staring at the water. For the first time in a long while, I felt the weight on my chest shift just slightly. It wasn't gone, but it was lighter. Over the following days, I noticed small changes in my parents as well. My mother's voice softened when she called, and there was less edge in her words. My father wasn't suddenly warm, but he no longer filled our conversations with threats or ultimatums. Something had shifted between us. The foundation was still cracked, but at least it wasn't built entirely on lies anymore. I knew better than to believe everything was healed. But the truth had started to come out in pieces. First through my own resolve, then through Todd's unexpected honesty. For the first time, it felt like the story wasn't just me against them. It was me standing tall and others beginning slowly to see why. As the sun disappeared completely, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. One phone call hadn't changed the past, but it had opened a door I thought would always stay shut. And that, in its own quiet way, felt like progress. The day of the housewarming arrived with clear skies and a calm breeze moving over the lake. The house stood gleaming, every detail carefully thought out, every corner carrying the mark of my choices. What had once been a battleground of arguments and entitlement was now a place filled with light and energy that belonged only to me. Guests began arriving in the late afternoon. Laughter and chatter carried across the deck as friends admired the views and explored the rooms. Ray, my contractor, walked proudly beside me, pointing out little details he knew I cared about. Hidden storage, the custom woodwork, the open kitchen that looked out over the water. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a reflection of resilience and freedom. The director from the foster program smiled warmly as she stepped into the new children's nook. This space will mean so much, she said, running her hand across the built-in shelves. You've created more than a home, you've created hope. Her words brought a lump to my throat. That reading corner had been one of my favorite parts of the renovation, a quiet statement that generosity was stronger than greed. As the evening carried on, my parents arrived. For a moment, the noise seemed to hush. Frank and Linda walked slowly through the entryway, their eyes wide, taking in the transformation. They moved from room to room, pausing at details they hadn't expected. The polished floors, the lake-facing windows, the warmth in each space. It all seemed to catch them off guard. My father finally spoke, his voice softer than I'd ever heard. "You've created something remarkable." He didn't elaborate, but the weight of the words said enough. For once, there was no bargaining, no demands, no guilt attached. Just recognition. I met his gaze for a moment before turning back to my guests. This wasn't about finally winning their approval. It was about showing myself that I never needed it to begin with. Later, as music filled the rooms and people gathered around the fire pit outside, I stepped back and let it all sink in. The laughter, the joy, the sense of peace. It was everything the house was meant to hold. I realized that through all the fights and confrontations, what I had truly rebuilt was not just the walls of the lake house, but the boundaries of my life. My family's opinion no longer controlled me. Their attempts to twist my future had failed. What stood now was proof of what could happen when I chose myself, when I put my energy into creating instead of defending. The night ended with my friends raising a toast. The glasses clinked, and I smiled, the weight of the past finally lifting. The house was more than wood and glass. It was the symbol of a woman who refused to be cornered, who turned betrayal into strength. And for the first time, I felt completely at home. The sun was setting in soft shades of orange and gold, casting long ripples across the lake. I stood on the dock, the wood still warm under my feet, and let the quiet sink into me. For the first time in years, I felt truly steady. This place, this view, belonged to me, not because it was given, but because I fought to keep it safe. My father's words came back to me, words I never thought I'd hear from him. Respecting boundaries isn't cruelty. It's adulthood. They lingered in my mind, not as an apology, but as an acknowledgement. For once, he seemed to understand that saying no wasn't rejection. It was survival. Brittany and I spoke now and then, but only when I chose to. Our connection was fragile, distant, but it no longer drained me. I didn't bend under her wants or her chaos. Whatever relationship we had would exist within the limits I set. I realized then that peace wasn't about keeping everyone happy or avoiding hard conversations. Peace came from standing firm, even when it meant upsetting people I loved. It came from protecting what mattered, even if it meant walking away from old expectations. The lake shimmered as the last light slipped below the horizon. I breathed deeply, the cool air filling my chest, and knew I had built more than a home. I had built a life defined by strength and choice. This dock, this water, this quiet moment, it was mine. Not because my family allowed it, but because I claimed it, protected it, and refused to surrender. And in that simple truth, I found the kind of peace I had always been searching for. Do you think I made the right decision by standing firm against my family, or should I have given in just to keep the peace? I'd really like to know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoy hearing stories like mine, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next one.